Close your eyes if you like, and let a voice carry you somewhere far away and a long time ago. Not to a place of noise or hurry, but to a flat, dark stretch of Italian farmland, quiet now, the way most places eventually go quiet again once the history has moved through them and moved on. It is the last hour before dawn on the 30th of January, 1944. Winter has settled over the reclaimed marshland south of Rome, the kind of damp, bone-deep cold that does not announce itself with snow so much as it simply sits in the ground and refuses to leave. And moving through that cold, in a long single file, boots finding uncertain footing along the bottom of a drainage ditch cut through the fields generations earlier to keep this reclaimed land from flooding, are several hundred American soldiers who call themselves Rangers. They are moving quietly, deliberately, the way men move when they have trained for exactly this kind of night and believe reasonably that they know what is waiting for them ahead. Their objective is a small town called Cisterna, a few miles inland from the beaches where American and British forces had come ashore just over a week earlier. Their plan is not to fight their way into that town. It is to slip past the German soldiers holding the ground in front of it, using this ditch and others like it for cover, and to arrive at Cisterna itself in the gray hour just after sunrise, while the garrison is still waking up, and take it by surprise before the Germans fully understand what has happened to them. It is, on paper, exactly the kind of mission these particular soldiers were built for. Quiet movement, precise timing. A small, superbly trained force accomplishing by stealth and nerve what a much larger force might only accomplish by brute force and heavy losses. It had worked for them before, more than once, on other nights, in other countries. This documentary is not going to rush toward what happened next, because what happened next deserves better than being rushed toward. But it is worth saying plainly, here at the very beginning, before a single shot has been described, that the number of men who set out along that ditch before dawn is remembered with real confidence by the historical record. Roughly 767 of them, organized into 2 battalions of Rangers, along with a small attached detachment of reconnaissance troops, crossed their line of departure in the darkness that morning, believing they were walking toward a lightly held town and an achievable objective. That number, 767, is the number this documentary will return to more than once over the next 2 hours, because it sits at the center of everything that follows. What is remembered with far less confidence, and what this documentary is not going to pretend is a settled question just to make the opening of this film feel tidier, is how many of those 767 men walked or crawled or ran their way back to American lines by the following afternoon. The number most often given, the number that has attached itself to this story in the way certain numbers attach themselves permanently to certain battles, is 6. 6 men out of 767 made it back. That is the figure carried in the title of this very film, and it is the figure this documentary will use as its headline number throughout, because it is the one repeated most often, in the most places, by the most sources. But it would not be honest, and this channel tries very hard never to be less than honest with you, to pretend that number is beyond dispute. The United States Army's own historians of its Special Operations Forces, writing decades later with access to a wider set of records, have put the number at 8, not 6. 8. This documentary will sit with that discrepancy properly when the time comes, in due course, well into this film, because it deserves a full and careful accounting rather than a passing mention. For now, at the beginning, it is enough to say this plainly. Somewhere between 6 and 8 men out of 767 came back. Everyone else was killed, captured, or simply never fully accounted for in the chaos of that day. That gap between 767 and single digits is the whole shape of this story, and everything this film tells you over the next 2 hours is, in one way or another, an attempt to understand how that gap came to exist. This is going to be a story told slowly, the way this channel has always tried to tell its stories, because these are not tales that improve by being hurried. Before this documentary takes you into the ditch itself, before it walks you through the plan and the men who made it, and the German forces waiting, largely unknown to Allied intelligence, on the other side of that flat winter ground, it is going to spend some real time with the people at the center of all of this. Not as names on a roster, not as ranks and unit designations, but as human beings, with hometowns and careers, and, in more than one case, families who were still waiting for letters home when this night began. It is going to introduce you to the colonel who built this force from nothing, and who was not, as it happens, among the men in that ditch that night, though what happened to his rangers would follow him for the rest of his own short life. It is going to introduce you to the 2 majors who led their battalions into that darkness, and to a captain and a sergeant major whose individual choices, hours later, would come to define how this entire battle is remembered. So, settle in. There is no need to hurry through any of it. Somewhere south of Rome, in the cold hour before dawn on the 30th of January, 1944, 767 men are walking quietly through a drainage ditch toward a town most of them will never actually reach, carrying a plan that had worked for men very much like them before, and that was about to fail in ways almost none of them could have anticipated. This documentary will tell you, patiently and carefully, exactly how that happened and exactly what it cost. But first, it wants you to know the man who built the unit walking through that ditch in the first place, because understanding him is the beginning of understanding everything that followed. William Orlando Darby was born on the 8th of February 1911 in Fort Smith, Arkansas, a town that sits right on the border with Oklahoma, where the flat farmland of the Arkansas River Valley begins to give way to the low hills further west. It is worth pausing on that hometown for a moment, because it will come back into this story much later, long after Darby himself is gone, in a way that says something about how thoroughly this one man came to be remembered by the place that raised him. But in the 1920s and early 1930s, he was simply a young man from a modest Arkansas family who wanted, by most accounts, a military career, and who earned an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He graduated in 1933, commissioned into the field artillery, and spent his first years as an officer the way many young artillery officers of that era did, serving in horse-mounted units, at a time when the American Army had not yet fully converted from animal-drawn guns to motorized ones. It is an almost unimaginable image now, a future commando leader learning his trade behind teams of horses, but it is also a useful reminder of just how much the Army Darby served in would change, and how quickly, over the following decade. That change accelerated sharply for Darby personally in the middle of 1942. The United States had been at war for barely 6 months. American forces had almost no combat experience against the German army, and British commanders, who had spent 2 hard years learning how to fight that army the hard way, were eager to help their new ally learn faster and with fewer mistakes. Out of that eagerness came an idea: raise a small, elite American unit, trained directly by British commando instructors, modeled closely on the British commandos themselves, and blood it in combined operations before committing larger American formations to action. The man selected to organize and command this new unit was Major William Darby, then just 31 years old. The unit itself needed a name, and the men organizing it chose to reach back nearly 2 centuries into American colonial history, to the irregular frontier fighters of Rogers Rangers, who had scouted and raided through the forests of colonial New York during the French and Indian War. The new unit would be called simply the Rangers, and Darby's would be the first battalion to carry that name into this war. Training took place at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands, at the British Commando Training Depot, under a regimen that had already earned a well-deserved reputation among British troops for being about as physically brutal as any training program the Allied armies ran anywhere. Live ammunition fired over the heads of men crawling through obstacle courses. Forced marches carrying full combat loads over some of the roughest terrain in the British Isles, conducted against the clock, with men who fell behind simply left behind. Darby went through it alongside his men rather than merely supervising it, which, by every account available, did a great deal to earn him the loyalty of the soldiers he was building into the 1st Ranger Battalion. That loyalty would matter enormously in the 2 years of hard fighting that followed, because Darby's leadership style, from the very beginning of this unit's existence, was built on the idea that he would not ask his Rangers to do anything he had not already proven he was willing to do himself. The battalion's first combat came that November in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, where Darby's Rangers spearheaded landings against Vichy French coastal defenses at Anzio in Algeria, silencing coastal gun batteries ahead of the main invasion force. It was a promising, largely successful debut, and it was followed, the following spring, by a much harder test. At the Battle of El Guettar in Tunisia in March of 1943, Darby's Rangers executed a night march of remarkable difficulty through mountainous terrain to seize high ground overlooking an Italian position, achieving complete tactical surprise and playing a significant role in one of the first clear American ground victories of the North African campaign. It was the kind of operation that made Darby's reputation, both within the Army and, increasingly, in the American press back home, where he began to be written about as one of the war's genuinely dashing young commanders. The success at El Guettar carried a direct institutional consequence for this story. It convinced Army planners that the Ranger concept was worth expanding, and Darby was authorized to organize 2 additional battalions, which this documentary will introduce properly in the chapter that follows this one, built around a cadre of experienced men drawn from his original battalion. By the time this story reaches the winter of 1944, Darby has been promoted to full colonel and placed in command of all 3 Ranger battalions together, organized formally as the 6,615th Ranger Force. He has led these men, in one capacity or another, through amphibious landings in Sicily, through a desperate defensive stand above the beaches at Salerno, and through months of brutal mountain fighting along the German winter defensive lines south of Rome. This documentary is not going to fully narrate what happens to Darby personally on the night this film centers on, the night of the 30th of January, because that story belongs properly to a later chapter, once you have met the other men who share it with him. But it is worth saying, plainly and simply, here at the start, that on that night, Darby is not among the men moving through the drainage ditch towards Cisterna. He is coordinating the operation from a command post nearer to the line his Rangers crossed that morning, receiving reports, growing steadily more concerned as those reports grow steadily more alarming, in a position that will leave him, by the following afternoon, absorbing news of a catastrophe he can hear unfolding over the radio, but cannot personally reach or reverse. Darby survived Cisterna. He went on, in the months that followed, to serve in staff roles and, eventually, in April of 1945, in the final weeks of the war in Italy, to take command as Assistant Division Commander of the 10th Mountain Division, a role that put him back in a forward combat position after a period away from direct troop command. On the 30th of April, 1945, near Lake Garda in northern Italy, William Darby was killed in action, struck by fragments from a German artillery shell. It was 2 days before German forces in Italy formally surrendered, and roughly a week before the war in Europe ended entirely. He was 34 years old. On the 15th of May, 2 weeks after his death, the Army promoted him posthumously to the rank of Brigadier General, and by most accounts available to this documentary, it remains the only posthumous promotion to general officer rank awarded within the United States Army during the whole of the Second World War. It is a striking, almost cruelly ironic detail to sit with at the start of this story. The man who built this Ranger force out of nothing, who trained alongside his soldiers rather than simply commanding them, who led them through victory after hard-won victory across 3 years of war, would not live to see the war's actual end by a matter of days, and would be honored, in the end, with a distinction granted to no one else who served in the entire American Army during that war. This documentary will return to Darby again before it is finished. But first, it wants to introduce you to the 2 men who actually led the battalions into that ditch on the night this story centers on, because their story and their choices that night deserve to be understood on their own terms before this film moves any further forward. Before this documentary can properly tell you what happened on the night of the 30th of January, it needs to introduce you to the 2 men who would actually lead their battalions into the ditch that night, because Darby, for all that his name has become synonymous with this Ranger force, was not the man giving orders on the ground once the column began moving. That responsibility belonged to Major John Dobson, known to the men who served under him as Jack, commanding the 1st Ranger Battalion, and to Major Alva Miller, commanding the 3rd Ranger Battalion. This documentary wants to be honest with you about something before it goes any further with these 2 men, because honesty about the limits of what is known is part of what this channel has always tried to promise its listeners. The historical record of the Second World War is, understandably, thickest around the men whose names became famous, and Darby's name became famous. Dobson's and Miller's did not, at least not outside the specialized circles of Ranger history and the archives of the units they commanded, and as a direct result, the kind of rich biographical detail available for Darby, the hometown, the West Point class, the horse-mounted artillery service, simply is not as fully documented for either of these 2 men in the general historical sources this production has been able to draw on. This documentary is not going to invent that detail to fill the gap. Where the record is thin, it will say so plainly, rather than presenting invented specifics as though they were established fact. What can be said with confidence is this: both men had risen to their battalion commands through the same demanding proving ground that shaped every officer in Darby's Ranger force. Both had led their units, or served in senior positions within them, through the earlier campaigns this documentary will describe in more detail shortly: the amphibious assaults in Sicily, the grinding defensive fight above the beaches at Salerno, and the brutal, attritional mountain fighting through the winter defensive lines south of Rome that consumed the months just before this story begins. By the time the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions crossed their line of departure on the night of the 30th of January, 1944, both Dobson and Miller were experienced combat commanders, trusted by Darby with an operation he considered squarely within his Ranger's particular skill set: a night infiltration through difficult terrain toward an objective believed to be lightly defended. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of mission these 2 men and the units they commanded had built their reputations executing successfully before. Major Dobson's 1st Battalion carried the harder half of the plan on the night this documentary centers on. His battalion would lead the column, moving first, absorbing whatever contact came first, and pushing furthest, closest to Cisterna itself, before the sun came up. Major Miller's 3rd Battalion would follow roughly 15 minutes behind, close enough to reinforce quickly if the lead battalion ran into trouble, but far enough back to maintain its own tactical integrity as a separate force with its own separate objective on the northeastern side of the town. This documentary will walk you through the specifics of that plan in careful detail a little further on. For now, it is enough to understand the basic shape of the responsibility resting on these 2 men's shoulders as they briefed their companies in the hours before the operation began. Get several hundred men each, quietly and undetected, across miles of open, flat farmland in full darkness, resting on nothing but drainage ditches for cover, and be ready to fight the moment that cover ran out. This documentary is not going to fully narrate, here in this early chapter, what became of either man once the fighting actually began, because their individual fates are inseparable from the larger battle itself, and telling them properly means telling them in their correct place within that longer account, several chapters from now. But it would be a kind of dishonesty, the sort of false suspense this channel has never found particularly respectful toward the people whose stories it is telling, to pretend those fates are not already, in a sense, decided by the time this story reaches them. So this documentary will say, gently and without dwelling on it further right now, that Major Miller would not survive the day that followed. He would be killed by German tank fire during the fighting that overtook his battalion. In the encirclement this documentary will describe fully several chapters ahead. Major Dobson would be wounded in that same fighting, and in the middle of that wounding, with his own battalion command increasingly cut off and Miller no longer able to lead his, would find himself assuming overall command of the trapped force, a responsibility that fell to him not by any plan drawn up in advance, but simply because the chain of command above him had, within a matter of hours, been shattered by circumstances nobody anticipated when this operation was first approved. It is worth sitting, for just a moment, with what that means. These were two majors, experienced, trusted, competent by every measure available to the historical record, given a mission that their commanding colonel himself described, and this documentary will give you his exact words a little further on, as squarely within his ranger's comfort zone, the kind of operation this force had trained for and executed successfully before. Neither man had reason, on the evening of the 29th of January, to believe he was leading his battalion toward the worst single day in the entire wartime history of Derby's Ranger Force. This documentary will introduce you, next to two more men from that same night, a captain and a sergeant major, whose individual actions in the hours ahead would come to stand in the memory of nearly every account written about this battle, since, as two of its most vivid and most human moments. There are two more men this documentary wants you to know before it takes you into the events of that night in any real detail, because their individual stories, more than almost any others connected to this battle, are the ones that have survived most vividly in the accounts written by the men who served alongside them. One is an officer whose nickname alone tells you something about how he was remembered. The other is a non-commissioned officer whose final words, spoken over a field radio in the middle of a battle, he already understood was lost, have become, in nearly every serious account of this story, written since, its emotional center of gravity. This documentary will let both of them speak for themselves, in their proper place, later in this film. For now, it wants simply to introduce you to who they were. Captain Charles Schunstrom commanded the rear companies of the 1st Ranger Battalion on the night this documentary centers on, the companies that had, as you will hear described more fully shortly, halted some distance behind the lead companies, pushing forward toward Cisterna when the German attack that would ultimately destroy this operation first began to develop. Schunstrom had already earned, well before that January morning, a reputation within the Ranger Force as an unusually aggressive, almost recklessly fearless combat leader, the kind of officer whose exploits tended to circulate through a unit's own internal folklore long before any historian wrote them down. It was this reputation that earned him the nickname by which he is still remembered in Ranger unit lore to this day, the Wild Man of Anzio. On the day this documentary centers on, Schunstrom was captured by German forces along with a portion of his command. He did not remain a prisoner. At some point in the days that followed, he escaped German custody and made his way back to Allied lines. This documentary wants to be honest with you here about the limits of what the historical sources actually establish, rather than filling in a more dramatic picture than the record actually supports. Exactly how Schunstrom escaped, and exactly how much time passed between his capture and his return to American lines, is not something this documentary has been able to pin down with real confidence. Some accounts of this story suggest the escape happened relatively quickly, within hours or perhaps a day or two, amid the general chaos and confusion of the fighting still spreading across the Cisterna front. Other tellings imply a longer captivity, closer to what might be expected of a man who had been moved back through German lines to a more formal holding area before finding his opportunity. This documentary is not going to pick between those two possibilities and present its choice to you as settled fact, because it is not settled, at least not in any source this production has been able to verify closely enough to trust. What can be said honestly, and what this documentary will say, is simply this. Charles Schunstrom was captured, and he later escaped, and he made his way back to his own side. The particulars of how and exactly when belong, for now, to the parts of this story that the record has not preserved with enough precision to narrate confidently. Sergeant Major Robert Ehalt served with the 3rd Ranger Battalion, and his role in this story is smaller in scope than Schunstrom's, but larger, in a real sense, in how this battle has come to be remembered. As the fighting around Cisterna deteriorated through the morning and into the afternoon of the 30th of January, with his battalion's position collapsing under German tank and infantry pressure and ammunition running out company by company, Ehalt remained at a radio, maintaining contact with Colonel Darby's command post as long as it was physically possible to do so. What he transmitted in the final substantive message to come out of the encircled Ranger pocket that day has been recorded, quoted, and requoted in nearly every serious account of this battle written in the 80 years since. This documentary is not going to give you those words yet. They belong, in their proper chronological place, several chapters ahead, at the point in this story where the battle itself has reached the moment Ehalt was actually living through when he spoke them, because delivering them out of that context would rob them of the weight they carry when heard exactly where they belong. What this documentary will tell you now is simply this. After sending that message, Ehalt destroyed his own radio equipment so that it could not be captured intact and put to use by the enemy, and he kept fighting from his position until it was overrun. It is worth pausing here, briefly, on why these two men in particular have been remembered so clearly across 8 decades of writing about this battle, when so many of the other names connected to this story, men who fought and died alongside them, have faded into the broader statistical record of casualties and captures that this documentary will lay out carefully in a later chapter. Part of the answer is simply that both men's actions were witnessed, or in Ehalt's case, transmitted in real time to a listening command post, in a way that many other individual acts of courage that day almost certainly were not. Most of what happened inside that collapsing perimeter on the 30th of January was never recorded by anyone who lived to describe it afterward. Schunstrom's escape and Ehalt's final transmission survived in the historical record precisely because someone was in a position to witness them and pass them along. That is worth remembering as this documentary moves forward into the fuller account of the battle itself. For every act of individual courage this film is able to name and describe to you, there were almost certainly many more, carried out by men whose names appear, if they appear at all, only on a casualty list, and whose particular moment of courage or desperation or simple endurance nobody survived to record. This documentary will try, where it can, to honor that larger, mostly silent group as well, even as it tells you the stories of the two men whose actions history happened to preserve. To understand why several hundred Rangers were moving through a drainage ditch towards Cisterna in the last hours of darkness on the 30th of January, this documentary needs to step back roughly 9 days to a stretch of Italian coastline about 30 miles south of Rome, and to a landing that was supposed to change the entire shape of the Italian campaign in a single, decisive stroke. By January of 1944, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had stalled badly. German forces had established a formidable defensive position known as the Winter Line, or the Gustav Line, anchored on the rugged high ground around the town of Cassino and the ancient hilltop monastery that overlooked it, and Allied armies had been throwing themselves against that line for weeks with grinding, costly, and largely unsuccessful results. Winston Churchill, among others, pushed hard for a different approach, an amphibious landing well behind the Gustav Line at the coastal towns of Anzio and Nettuno that would land a substantial Allied force directly in the German rear, threaten Rome itself, and force the German High Command to either abandon the Cassino defenses to deal with this new threat or risk having their entire southern front cut off from behind. The operation was given the code name Shingle, and it launched on the 22nd of January, 1944. The landing itself went remarkably well, at least at first. American and British forces of the newly formed 6th Corps, commanded by Major General John P. Lucas, came ashore against minimal initial resistance. The force included the American 3rd Infantry Division, the British 1st Infantry Division, Darby's Ranger Force, and elements of paratroop and commando units, and within the first day it had secured a beachhead with remarkably light casualties for an opposed amphibious landing. For a brief window of time in those first hours and days, the road to Rome itself lay, by most later assessments, almost entirely open. German forces in the immediate vicinity of Anzio were thin, disorganized, and in no position to mount any serious resistance to a rapid, aggressive push inland. That push did not happen, at least not with the speed and aggression that many, both at the time and in the decades of writing about this campaign since, believed the situation called for. General Lucas instead spent the first days after the landing consolidating his beachhead, building up supplies and reinforcements, and moving cautiously, rather than driving hard and fast toward the Alban Hills that overlooked the surrounding countryside, or toward Rome itself. This documentary wants to treat what happened next as honestly as it can, because the question of whether Lucas made the right decision in those first days is genuinely, seriously contested among historians of this campaign, and it would be a disservice to the complexity of that question to present it here as though it were simple. The traditional account of what happened, the version that dominated popular memory of Anzio for decades after the war, places the blame for what followed squarely on Lucas's personal caution. In this telling, Lucas had a clear opportunity to seize the initiative while German defenses around the beachhead were still weak and disorganized, and instead chose to dig in and wait, giving the German commander in Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, precisely the time he needed to rush reinforcements to the area and ring the beachhead with new defensive positions, transforming what should have been a decisive outflanking maneuver into a static, costly siege that would drag on for months. This is the version of the story that gave Anzio its lasting popular reputation as a squandered opportunity, and it is not, this documentary should say clearly, a version invented out of nothing. It reflects genuine frustration expressed at the time by superiors who wanted faster movement, and it reflects a real strategic reality. The beachhead did, in fact, become bottled up, and the breakout that Shingle was designed to achieve quickly did not come for another 4 months. But a significant body of more recent scholarship complicates that story considerably, and this documentary thinks it deserves to be heard alongside the traditional account rather than dismissed in favor of it. Lucas's actual orders from his direct superior, Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, were themselves genuinely ambiguous about how aggressively he was expected to push inland, and Lucas had been given a smaller force than he had originally requested for the operation, one that some historians argue was simply not large enough to both hold a beachhead against likely German counterattack and simultaneously drive a rapid armored thrust deep into unknown territory without serious risk of that advancing force being cut off, surrounded, and destroyed well before it could link up with the main beachhead or receive adequate support. Under this reading, the failure at Anzio belongs less to Lucas personally and more to the broader planning of the operation at Allied Forces headquarters, under the overall Mediterranean Theater Commander, General Sir Harold Alexander, which some historians argue sent an under-resourced force ashore with a poorly defined mission and unrealistic expectations for what it could accomplish. This documentary is not going to resolve that argument for you, because the argument is not resolved among the historians who have studied it far more closely than this film can hope to in the time available. What is not disputed, whichever explanation one finds more persuasive, is what happened to Lucas's own career as a direct result. He was relieved of command of 6th Corps on the 22nd of February, 1944, replaced by Major General Lucien Truscott, and in the decades that followed, regardless of how the historical argument has evolved, the popular verdict on Lucas settled hard and largely unmoving into a single word: too timid. That verdict, fair or not, is the one most people who have heard of Anzio at all still carry with them today. By late January, in any case, the beachhead Lucas had built was coming under increasing German pressure as Kesselring's reinforcements arrived and began probing and testing the Allied perimeter. Allied commanders, looking for a way to relieve that pressure and regain some measure of the initiative that had slipped away in the operation's opening days, ordered a major push toward the Alban Hills and toward Cisterna, intended to expand the beachhead, disrupt the buildup of German forces opposite it, and set conditions for the eventual breakout that Shingle had always been meant to achieve. That push was launched on the 30th of January, 1944. This documentary wants to be careful and precise about one specific point of naming here, because it is a detail that gets confused in a fair amount of writing about this period, and getting it right matters. This January offensive is sometimes conflated, in less careful accounts, with a later operation called Operation Buffalo, but that is a mistake this documentary will not repeat. Operation Buffalo was a different, much larger Psi Corps breakout offensive, launched in May of 1944, months after the events this film is telling you about tonight. No source this documentary has found gives the 30th of January attack a distinct code name of its own. It will be referred to here simply as the attack toward Cisterna, because that is what it was, and because inventing or borrowing a code name that does not belong to it would be exactly the kind of small, careless distortion this channel has always tried to avoid. It was into this broader attack, ordered to relieve pressure on a beachhead already fighting for its own survival, that Darby's Ranger infiltration was folded, as the spearhead assigned to the Corps' right flank, tasked with the boldest and most difficult single objective of the entire operation, taking Cisterna itself by stealth before the sun came up. This documentary told you, a couple of chapters ago, that Darby's success at El Guitar led directly to the authorization of 2 additional Ranger battalions beyond his original unit. It is worth pausing here, before this film takes you into the plan for the 30th of January in full detail, to properly introduce those additional battalions, and to walk through the combat history that shaped all 3 of them into the force that would eventually be committed to the attack on Cisterna, because that history matters enormously to understanding what happened, and several historians who have studied this battle closely consider it essential context rather than simple background. After El Guitar, the 3rd Ranger Battalion was formed, initially commanded by Major, later Lieutenant Colonel, Herman Dammer, and the 4th Ranger Battalion was formed alongside it, commanded by Major, later Lieutenant Colonel, Roy Murray. Both units were built substantially around a cadre of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers drawn from Darby's original battalion, spreading that unit's hard-won combat experience and its distinctive training culture across a larger force. This documentary wants to draw a clear and important distinction here, because it is a point of genuine confusion in a fair amount of general writing about Ranger history, and getting it right matters to keeping this particular story straight. A separate 2nd Ranger Battalion also existed during the Second World War, but it was raised entirely independently in the United States, and it fought in an entirely different theater in northwestern Europe, most famously scaling the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc on the morning of D-Day. That 2nd Battalion was never under Darby's command, and it was never deployed to Italy. It has no direct role in this story. Only the 1st, 3rd, and 4th Ranger Battalions, all commanded at various points either directly by Darby or by officers under his overall Ranger Force command, are part of the events this documentary is telling you about tonight. Together, these 3 battalions built a combat record before Cisterna that was, by any measure, exceptional. In July of 1943, they spearheaded amphibious assaults in the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, landing at Gela and at Licata, and fighting hard in the difficult days that followed to help secure those beachheads, later contributing to the broader Allied advance that eventually took the Sicilian capital of Palermo. Then, in September of 1943, at Salerno, on the Italian mainland itself, the Ranger Force was given a very different kind of mission than the raiding operations that had built its reputation. Landing at the town of Maiori, the Rangers pushed inland and seized the Chiunzi Pass, a critical piece of high ground overlooking the approaches to Naples, and then held that pass, under sustained and heavy German counterattack, for more than 2 weeks. This was a static, defensive fight, trench warfare in the mountains, rather than the fast, mobile, stealth-driven raiding this force had been built and trained to execute, and it cost them accordingly. Roughly 28 men killed, 9 missing, and more than 66 wounded in that fighting alone. This documentary wants to flag that pattern clearly here, because it is going to recur, and because several historians who have written carefully about this Ranger Force consider it one of the most important pieces of context for understanding everything that eventually happened at Cisterna. That pattern continued, and in some ways deepened, through the months that followed. From October of 1943 through January of 1944, all 3 battalions were committed to the brutal fighting along the German winter line, in the mountainous country around San Pietro, Venafro, and the approaches to Cassino, used once again not as raiding troops striking quickly and withdrawing, but as conventional mountain infantry, holding ground and attacking fortified positions in terrain that favored the defender at every turn. The losses in this extended stretch of fighting were heavy, adding steadily to the toll the Ranger Force had already paid at Salerno, and by the time this documentary story properly begins, in the last days of January 1944, these were battalions that had already been fighting, hard and almost continuously, for the better part of 7 months, in roles that increasingly bore little resemblance to the specialized commando-style missions they had originally been created and trained to perform. This is a point several historians, including the United States Army's own historians of its Special Operations Forces writing decades later, return to again and again when they examine this unit's history, and this documentary thinks it is worth stating plainly here, well before the battle itself, rather than only raising it afterward as an explanation for what went wrong. Darby's Rangers had been built as an elite, lightly equipped force, superbly trained for quick, decisive raids executed by stealth and speed against limited objectives, then withdrawn before a heavier enemy response could be organized against them. That is genuinely what they had trained for at Aknakari, and it is what they had executed successfully in their early operations. But by the winter of 1944, they had increasingly been employed instead as conventional line infantry, thrown into extended, static, attritional fighting, for which they carried neither the heavy weapons, nor the armor support, nor the sheer numerical depth that ordinary infantry divisions could draw on when a fight went badly. This documentary will return to this theme with much more weight in a later chapter, once you have heard the full account of what happened on the 30th of January itself. For now, it is enough to plant the observation here, early, so that it can sit quietly in the background of everything that follows. It is worth pausing, briefly, on what this 7-month stretch of near-continuous combat actually demanded of the individual men filling out the ranks of these 3 battalions. Unlike a conventional infantry division, which could expect to rotate battalions in and out of the line, resting one formation while another took its turn at the front, the Ranger force was small enough and specialized enough that the same core group of men tended to be called on again and again, campaign after campaign, with comparatively little opportunity for the kind of extended rest and reconstitution that larger divisions further back in the theater's overall structure could sometimes provide their own troops. Replacements did arrive, filling gaps left by the killed and the wounded and the sick, but the institutional culture and hard-won small unit cohesion that had made this force so effective in its earliest operations depended heavily on a shrinking core of veterans who had now been in nearly constant contact with the enemy since the summer before. That is the condition in which these 3 battalions entered the winter of 1944, proven, disciplined, and still capable of executing exactly the kind of night infiltration this documentary described in the plan for Cisterna, but also worn down by months of fighting that had already asked more of them, in a conventional infantry role, than the specialized force Darby had built at Achnacarry had ever really been designed to sustain. On the 11th of December, 1943, in recognition of the force these 3 battalions had become, and the increasingly complex coordination their missions required, they were formally organized, together with supporting units, as the 6,615th Ranger Force, Provisional. Darby, now a full colonel, held overall command, with Lieutenant Colonel Dammer, formerly commander of the 3rd Battalion, serving as his executive officer. It was this organization, the 6,615th Ranger Force, built from 3 battalions that had already absorbed 7 hard months of combat and mounting losses, that would be committed, 7 weeks later, to the boldest and most consequential single mission in its entire short history. An infiltration through the dark, flat farmland south of Cisterna, toward a town its intelligence assessments believed was held by little more than a thin outpost screen. Now that this documentary has introduced you to the men who conceived and led this operation, and to the larger campaign it was folded into, it wants to walk you through the plan itself, carefully, and in the kind of precise detail that will matter enormously once this film reaches the account of how that plan actually unfolded on the ground. The overall objective was Cisterna, a small town of a few thousand people, sitting on relatively open, flat reclaimed farmland a few miles inland from the Anzio beachhead, at an important road junction that made it valuable to both sides for very practical reasons. Whoever held Cisterna controlled movement along several roads radiating out from it, including routes that fed directly into the German defensive positions further inland and eventually toward Rome itself. The plan called for 3 separate forces, moving along 3 separate routes to converge on that town in a coordinated sequence. The 1st Ranger Battalion, under Major Dobson, would carry the most demanding piece of the plan. Starting from the American lines, Dobson's battalion would cross its line of departure and move roughly 4 miles through open farmland, using the network of irrigation and drainage ditches that crisscrossed this reclaimed agricultural land as its only real source of concealment, in order to reach the outskirts of Cisterna at dawn. Once there, the battalion was to enter the town itself, destroy or overwhelm whatever German garrison it found holding it, and then occupy defensive ground to the northwest of the town, securing that flank against any German counterattack from that direction. The 3rd Ranger Battalion, under Major Miller, would follow roughly 15 minutes behind Dobson's battalion, close enough to reinforce quickly, but staged deliberately to preserve its own separate tactical integrity. Miller's battalion carried 2 responsibilities: to engage and deal with any German forces that attempted to interfere with the 1st Battalion's advance from the flank or rear, and, once Cisterna itself was in American hands, to occupy ground to the northeast of the town and link up there with the 15th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division, which was advancing on Cisterna along a separate axis as part of the broader attack this documentary described in the previous chapter. The 4th Ranger Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Roy Murray, was assigned a genuinely different role from the other 2, advancing along a separate, more conventional route, the road running from Conca, through the small settlement of Isola Bella, and on toward Cisterna itself. Murray's battalion was to begin its advance at 2 o'clock in the morning, clearing mines and German outposts as it moved, serving as the operations reserve and follow-on force, ready to push forward and link up with the 1st and 3rd Battalions once they had secured the town by infiltration. It was, in effect, the heavier, more conventional half of a plan, whose other half depended almost entirely on stealth. These 3 battalions did not move alone. The operation was supported by the Ranger Force's own cannon company, providing direct fire support, along with a platoon drawn from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, elements of the 83rd Chemical Mortar Battalion, whose heavy mortars could deliver substantial supporting fire without the visible muzzle flash of conventional artillery, and a platoon of roughly 43 men drawn from the 3rd Reconnaissance Troop, attached directly to the infiltrating force to help screen its movement and report on what lay ahead. The precise route followed by the 2 infiltrating battalions is worth laying out carefully because the terrain itself is central to understanding both why this plan seemed sound on paper and why it proved so costly in practice. At 1:30 in the morning, the 1st and 3rd Battalions crossed the western branch of the Mussolini Canal, a large drainage waterway constructed years earlier as part of an ambitious fascist-era land reclamation project that had turned this stretch of malarial marshland into productive farmland. Once across the canal, the column moved northwest along a much narrower feature called the Pantano Ditch, a drainage channel distinct from the Mussolini Canal itself, running roughly parallel to the main road connecting Conca and Cisterna. It was this ditch, narrow, largely sunken below the surrounding field level, and offering real, if imperfect, concealment from observation, that gave this plan its entire reason for existing. Move quietly enough, low enough, and fast enough along its length, and several hundred men might cross open, heavily watched farmland essentially unseen. The intelligence assessment underpinning this entire plan held that Cisterna itself was defended only lightly, by what planning documents and after-action summaries describe as a thin screen of outposts, forces sufficient to provide early warning of a conventional daylight advance, but not remotely sufficient to stop a well-executed nighttime infiltration before it could close on the town and overwhelm the garrison by surprise. It was an assessment that, as this documentary will explain in careful detail in the chapter that follows this one, would prove catastrophically wrong, though not importantly, because the plan itself was reckless or poorly conceived given what its planners actually knew at the time. Given accurate intelligence about what was actually waiting on the other side of that ditch, this operation might well have unfolded very differently. It was not given that intelligence, and that gap between what Allied commanders believed about Cisterna's defenses and what was actually arrayed there sits close to the very center of why this story ends the way it does. Colonel Darby himself, discussing this operation afterward, offered a line that this documentary thinks is worth quoting directly because it captures, in a handful of words, exactly how reasonable this plan appeared to the man who approved it, based on everything his Rangers had already proven capable of in Sicily and at El Guetar, and in the earlier stages of the Italian campaign. The plan, Darby said, was not an unusual one for my Rangers. In fact, it was down our alley. That confidence was not misplaced arrogance. It was earned, built on a real and substantial record of exactly this kind of operation succeeding, against exactly this kind of objective, more than once before. Every officer briefing his company that evening, and every sergeant passing the plan down to the men in his squad, had good reason, based on everything this force had already accomplished together, to believe they were being asked to do something difficult but entirely within their proven capabilities, not something reckless or beyond what Rangers had already shown themselves able to do. What made the 30th of January different, tragically and decisively different, is the subject of the chapter that comes next. This documentary told you, in the previous chapter, that Allied intelligence going into the night of the 30th of January believed Cisterna was held only by a thin screen of German outposts. It is worth spending real time now on what that intelligence assessment failed to capture, because the gap between what Allied commanders believed and what was actually waiting on the other side of that ditch is, more than any single other factor, the reason this story unfolds the way it does. In the days immediately preceding the 30th of January, German forces in the Cisterna sector were reinforced substantially, far beyond anything reflected in the intelligence picture available to the officers planning the Ranger infiltration. This documentary wants to be as precise as the available sources allow about exactly which German units the Rangers actually encountered that morning, because a fair amount of writing about this battle tends to list an alarmingly long roster of German divisions supposedly present at Cisterna, and this documentary does not want to simply repeat that longer list without qualification, since much of it likely reflects the general German order of battle across the wider Anzio beachhead on that date, rather than units specifically confirmed to have engaged the Rangers themselves in the fighting around Cisterna. The best attested units, the ones that appear consistently and specifically in accounts of the actual fighting the Rangers found themselves in, were the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, one of the more formidable armored formations available to the German army in Italy at that time, elements of the 715th Infantry Division, which by this stage of the war had been substantially motorized and equipped well beyond a typical foot-mobile infantry formation, and a parachute element, variously identified in different sources as the 2nd Parachute Layer Battalion, or as elements of the 1st Parachute Division. Together, these forces brought at least 17 Panzer IV tanks into the fighting, along with self-propelled guns, flak vehicles pressed into a ground combat role against the Rangers rather than their normal anti-aircraft duties, and a substantial concentration of supporting artillery. This documentary will lead with these three well-attested formations throughout its account of the battle itself, and will note, gently and without dwelling on it, that broader listings adding several additional German divisions to the roster of forces present should be read with some caution, as likely reflecting the wider battlefield rather than the specific enemy the Rangers actually fought. What this buildup was actually for is a question this documentary wants to address carefully, because the honest answer complicates a natural assumption a listener might otherwise make. It would be easy to assume that German forces had somehow learned of the planned Ranger infiltration in advance, and had reinforced the Cisterna sector specifically to spring a trap for it. The evidence available to this documentary does not clearly support that reading. Instead, the German buildup around Cisterna in late January appears to have been driven by Field Marshal Kesselring's own planning for a major counteroffensive against the Anzio beachhead, an operation the German High Command was preparing entirely independently of anything happening on the Allied side, aimed at crushing the beachhead before it could be reinforced further and used as a springboard for a breakout toward Rome. Under this reading, the Rangers, moving quietly through the Pantano ditch in the dark hours before dawn, were not walking into a trap built specifically to catch them. They were walking, largely by coincidence of timing, into a sector that had already been heavily reinforced and placed on a significantly higher state of alert for entirely unrelated reasons of the Germans' own. This documentary wants to be honest, though, about how settled that explanation actually is, because it is not entirely settled, and presenting it as though it were would be exactly the kind of false certainty this channel has always tried to avoid. The official history of the United States Army's operations in Italy leans, in places, toward language, suggesting German forces may have detected the Rangers' approach with enough advance warning to prepare a more deliberate ambush along their route, rather than simply happening to be present in overwhelming strength when the column arrived. Other accounts frame what happened more as a matter of bad luck and coincidental timing, an infiltration force stumbling into an already alert, already reinforced position that had nothing specifically to do with them. This documentary is going to present both of these readings to you, honestly, rather than artificially resolving the tension between them in favor of whichever version makes for a cleaner narrative. The truth may well be some combination of both. A sector that was already more alert than Allied intelligence understood, in which German forces, once the Rangers were detected moving through the ditches in the pre-dawn hours, reacted quickly and effectively to a threat that then came into contact with a defense already far stronger than anyone on the American side expected. There is one more piece of this picture worth including here, a detail that several post-war assessments have raised as a documented strategic irony sitting alongside the human cost of this battle. The German counteroffensive that this build-up around Cisterna had been assembled to support was itself scheduled to launch only a short time after the 30th of January. Several post-war assessments suggest that the fighting touched off by the Ranger attack and the broader Allied offensive it was part of disrupted the timing of that planned German counteroffensive, forcing Kesselring's forces to react to an unplanned crisis rather than launching their own attack on their own schedule. It does not undo or meaningfully offset what happened to the men in the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions that day, and this documentary is not going to suggest that it does. But it is a detail worth including honestly, because it is part of the full picture. A battle that cost this Ranger force almost everything it had also appears, by the assessment of some historians studying the wider campaign, to have thrown a wrench into the German army's own plans for the days that followed, whether or not that outcome was any comfort at all to the men who paid for it. At 1:30 in the morning on the 30th of January, 1944, the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions crossed the western branch of the Mussolini Canal and began their movement along the Pantano Ditch, exactly as the plan this documentary described in an earlier chapter had specified. The 1st Battalion led the column, with the 3rd Battalion following roughly 15 minutes behind, maintaining the interval that was meant to let each battalion operate with its own tactical integrity while remaining close enough to support the other, if trouble developed. For the first stretch of that long, cold night march, the plan appears to have worked essentially as intended. The column moved quietly along the bottom of the ditch, low enough and disciplined enough that it passed several German positions along its route without being detected. Exactly the kind of stealthy infiltration these Rangers had trained for and executed successfully in earlier operations. It is worth sitting, briefly, with how it must have felt in those early hours before anything had gone wrong. Hundreds of men moving in near total silence through freezing mud and standing water, each one trusting that the man ahead of him knew the route, each one aware that the entire operation depended on nobody making a sound loud enough to carry across the flat, open fields on either side of the ditch. That fragile margin began to erode gradually, well before the fighting itself started, through a series of small breakdowns that on their own might not have mattered much, but that compounded steadily as the night wore on. At around 12 minutes to 3 in the morning, 4 radio operators became separated from the main column and lost contact with it entirely. This documentary wants to underline how much this single, almost mundane breakdown would come to matter later in the day. Radio communication was the only thread connecting the infiltrating battalions to Colonel Darby's command post, to the 4th Battalion advancing along its separate route, and to the artillery and other supporting fires that might, under different circumstances, have been called down to help a battalion in serious trouble. Losing 4 radio operators in the dark, disorganized movement of a night march might have seemed, in the moment, like a manageable setback. By the time the sun came up and the shooting started, it would prove to be one of the most consequential failures of the entire operation, badly degrading this force's ability to report its own situation clearly, to coordinate with the units meant to support it, and, eventually, to call for the kind of help that might have changed how this day ended. Sometime later, in that same overnight movement, the 3rd Battalion lost contact with the 1st Battalion ahead of it, the two forces that were meant to be operating in close, mutually supporting sequence drifting apart in the darkness and confusion of a long night march across difficult, poorly marked terrain. And within the 1st Battalion itself, a further split occurred. 3 lead companies continued pushing forward toward Cisterna, while 3 rear companies, under the command of Captain Charles Schunstrom, the officer this documentary introduced to you a few chapters ago, halted some distance behind them. The precise sequence and reasoning behind that halt is not laid out with complete clarity in the sources available to this documentary, but its consequence would prove significant once the German attack began. It meant that when the crisis came, the 1st Battalion was not operating as a single, unified force, but as 2 separated groups, out of easy contact with one another, each facing its own version of what was about to happen. It is worth spending a moment on the physical experience of that night march itself, because it shaped everything that followed. This was late January, in a stretch of reclaimed marshland that had been agricultural fields for only about 2 decades, land that, in an earlier generation, had been malarial swamp, drained and resettled under an ambitious engineering project completed only a handful of years before the war reached it. The ground underfoot, even along the raised sides of the drainage ditches the Rangers used for cover, was sodden and uneven, cut through with standing water that had partially frozen in patches overnight, the kind of cold that soaks through leather boots within the first hour and does not let go again until long after daylight. The men moved in column, single file in most stretches, weapons carried at the ready, but not fired, because the entire logic of this operation depended on total silence holding for hours at a stretch, across a distance of roughly 4 miles from the line of departure to the outskirts of Cisterna itself. Every man in that column understood, at some level, that a single burst of gunfire at the wrong moment, a single dislodged stone or unexpected splash in the dark, could bring the whole careful plan down around all of them at once. That kind of sustained, silent discipline, held for hours in freezing conditions by men who had already been fighting almost continuously for months, says something about the caliber of the force Darby had built, regardless of how the night eventually ended. The 3rd Reconnaissance Troop Platoon attached to the column, the roughly 43 men this documentary mentioned in the previous chapter, moved with the lead elements, screening the advance and reporting back on the ground ahead as best they could given the darkness and the flat, largely featureless terrain. For the first several hours, by every account available to this documentary, their reports gave no serious indication of the danger the column was actually walking toward. The German outposts the Rangers did detect and bypass in the early part of the march appeared consistent with the thin defensive screen Allied intelligence had predicted, which can only have reinforced, in the minds of the men leading this column, a growing confidence that the operation was unfolding exactly as planned. By dawn, somewhere between 6 o'clock and 6:30 in the morning, the lead elements of the 1st Battalion had reached a position roughly 800 yards south of Cisterna itself. They were close now, closer to their objective than they had been at any point in the night's long, careful movement, and for a brief window, the plan that Darby had called down our alley must have seemed to be working exactly as intended. But the terrain ahead of them had changed in a way that mattered enormously. The concealing ditches and drainage channels that had carried this column undetected across miles of open farmland ran out here, close to the town itself, and the ground between the Rangers and Cisterna was flat, open, and offered essentially no cover at all. The men who had spent the entire night moving quietly and invisibly through the dark now found themselves, in the gray light of an Italian winter dawn, standing in open country with nowhere left to hide, and with the objective they had worked all night to reach still 800 yards away, across ground with no concealment left to offer them. It was at this point, in this exposed position, that the plan Darby had described with such confidence began, within a matter of minutes, to come apart entirely, in ways that neither he nor Dobson nor Miller nor any of the men under their command had any real way of anticipating in advance. What happened next is the subject of the chapter that follows. The Rangers, standing in the open ground roughly 800 yards south of Cisterna, in the gray light of that January dawn, were not alone out there for long. A strong German force, spearheaded by 3 self-propelled guns, opened fire on the exposed lead elements of the 1st Battalion. For a brief period, the Rangers' training and nerve held, using bazookas, the anti-tank rocket launchers that had become standard infantry equipment by this stage of the war. They managed to destroy all 3 of the self-propelled guns that had opened the engagement. It was, on its own, a genuinely impressive piece of close combat. Small teams of infantrymen taking on armored vehicles at close range in open ground and winning that particular exchange decisively. But it bought only a brief window, because those 3 guns were not the whole of what the Germans had waiting in and around Cisterna that morning. Within a short span of time, much larger German infantry, armor, and artillery forces, converging from multiple directions across the open farmland, began closing around the exposed Rangers, and what had been, moments before, an advancing infiltration force pushing toward its objective became, instead, a force fighting simply to hold its ground, with open country on every side and no concealment left anywhere near it. At 7:30 that morning, the 1st Battalion broke the radio silence it had maintained so carefully through the entire night march, transmitting back to Darby's command post a first report of just how serious its situation had become. This documentary asked you, in an earlier chapter, to remember the 4 radio operators lost during the overnight movement, and to remember why that loss mattered. It mattered here, in this moment, and the hours that followed, because the communication channel available to report this crisis, to call for supporting fire, to coordinate any kind of relief, was already badly degraded before the first shot of the actual battle had even been fired. Darby's command post, receiving this transmission, now understood that his Rangers were in serious trouble, out in open ground short of their objective, under attack by a force considerably stronger than anything the intelligence picture had prepared anyone to expect. What Darby could actually do about it, from a command post several miles away, connected to his trapped battalions by a radio link that was itself failing intermittently, was tragically limited. Sometime during the morning's fighting, Major Alva Miller, commanding the 3rd Ranger Battalion, was killed by German tank fire. This documentary introduced you to Miller several chapters ago, told you then, gently, that this moment was coming, and it is worth pausing here, in its proper place in the story, to sit with what his death meant for the battalion he had led into that ditch only hours earlier. Miller had commanded his men through the entire preceding stretch of this war, through Sicily and Salerno and the brutal winter fighting that came after, and now, on a flat field south of a town his battalion had never reached, he was gone, in the middle of a fight that was only getting worse. Major Dobson, commanding the 1st Battalion, was himself wounded in this same stretch of fighting. And with Miller dead and Dobson wounded, it fell to Dobson, injured, his own battalion under direct attack, to assume overall command of the entire trapped force, both battalions together, a responsibility that had not been assigned to him in any plan drawn up in advance, but that came to him simply because the chain of command immediately above the company level had, within the space of a single morning, been shattered by the fighting itself. At noon, German tanks came down from the direction of Highway 7, the major road running through this stretch of countryside, adding fresh armored pressure to a perimeter that was already contracting under fire from multiple directions. The Rangers, forced into increasingly open ground with each passing hour, found their ammunition running critically low, a problem that would only compound as the afternoon wore on, and no meaningful relief arrived to resupply or reinforce them. This documentary wants to include, here, a detail that appears in multiple accounts of this battle, while being careful and precise about exactly how well that detail is actually sourced, because that precision matters, and this channel has never wanted to blur the line between what is firmly established and what is more loosely attested. Several secondary accounts of this battle describe German forces pushing captured Rangers out in front of their advancing tanks, using them as human shields to compel the remaining pockets of resistance to surrender, rather than continue firing and risk hitting their own captured comrades. This documentary is not going to present that detail to you as an established fact drawn from the primary official history of this operation, because it was not found there. It is presented here explicitly as something reported by multiple secondary accounts of the battle, a detail this documentary considers worth including, so that you have the fuller picture available in the historical writing about this day. But 1. This documentary is not in a position to independently verify beyond noting how often it recurs across accounts written well after the fact. This documentary wants you to picture, for a moment, what this contracting perimeter actually looked like from inside it, insofar as the fragmentary record allows. Small groups of Rangers, cut off from neighboring units by fields, swept with machine gun and tank fire, using whatever irrigation ditches and low stone walls the terrain still offered as makeshift cover, fighting increasingly isolated actions rather than a single coordinated defense. Runners sent between positions to relay orders or request ammunition, because the radio network that should have carried that information was already failing. Wounded men treated where they fell, because there was no way to evacuate them to safety across open ground swept by German fire from multiple directions at once. This was not, by the middle of the day, a battle in the sense of two organized forces maneuvering against one another. It had become, for the men trapped inside it, a series of smaller, increasingly desperate last stands, each one fighting largely alone, each one running out of the same thing at roughly the same time. By early afternoon, the shape of what was happening to the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions had become unmistakable, even from the fragmentary, deteriorating radio reports still reaching Darby's command post. 2 battalions that had crossed their line of departure the previous night as a confident, well-trained infiltration force, moving quietly toward an objective they expected to take largely unopposed, were now surrounded, in open ground, running low on ammunition, having already lost one of their 2 battalion commanders, and had the other wounded and holding overall command almost by default. What remained of the fighting through the rest of that day, the final hours of organized resistance, and the individual acts of courage and desperation that came with them, is the subject the next chapter of this film will tell you, as carefully and as completely as the historical record allows. At 12:30 in the afternoon, Darby's command post received what would prove to be one of the last substantive messages to come out of the trapped Ranger position that day. By this point, according to the accounts this documentary has been able to draw on, only about 10 men remained gathered around the battalion command post radio itself, a number worth sitting with for a moment, given that this same command post had, less than 12 hours earlier, been at the center of a force numbering in the hundreds. The perimeter around that radio had contracted, hour by hour, through the morning and into the early afternoon, as ammunition ran out, as men were killed or wounded or captured in the fighting, spreading across the open ground on every side, until what remained of the entire operation's ability to communicate with the outside world rested with this small handful of men and whatever charge was left in their equipment. It was sometime in this stretch of the early to mid-afternoon that Sergeant Major Robert Ehalt of the 3rd Ranger Battalion sent the transmission this documentary has been building toward since it first introduced you to him several chapters ago. This documentary told you then that his words had become, across 8 decades of writing about this battle, something close to its emotional center, and it asked you to wait until this moment, the moment Ehalt himself was actually living through, to hear them in full. Here, now, in their proper place, are the words Sergeant Major Ehalt transmitted to Colonel Darby, as this force reached the end of what it had left to give. Some of the fellows are giving up. Colonel, we are awfully sorry. They can't help it, because we're running out of ammunition. This documentary is not going to rush past those words, or move quickly on to what happened next, because they deserve better than that. Consider what is actually being communicated in that short transmission. Not a request for rescue that both men on either end of that radio link almost certainly understood, by this point, was not coming in time. Not an accusation or a search for blame aimed at the intelligence failures or the command decisions that had put this force in this position in the first place. An apology. A sergeant major watching men under his command lay down their weapons because they had nothing left to fight with, taking a moment, in the middle of the worst hour of his own life, to tell his colonel that he was sorry, and to make sure Darby understood that the men surrendering were not failing in courage, were not failing in anything at all, but were simply out of ammunition, and had no other choice left available to them. It is, this documentary believes, as clear and as human a window as this entire battle offers into what it actually felt like, from the inside, to be one of the men living through those final hours on that flat field outside Cisterna. After sending that transmission, Ehalt destroyed his own radio, ensuring it could not be captured intact and used by the forces closing in around his position, and he kept fighting from where he stood until that position, too, was overrun. This documentary does not know, and has not found a source that can tell you, precisely what happened to Ehalt personally in the minutes after his position fell, whether he was killed there or taken prisoner along with the men around him. What the record does preserve, clearly and without dispute, is that final transmission and the fact that he chose to keep fighting rather than surrender immediately after sending it, buying whatever additional time his continued resistance could buy for whoever might still have been listening on the other end of that failing radio link. By mid to late morning and into the early afternoon, organized resistance across the trapped perimeter had, by every account available to this documentary, effectively ceased. The bulk of the 2 battalions that had crossed the Mussolini Canal so quietly and so confidently roughly 12 hours earlier were now, in the span of a single winter morning, either dead or in German hands. This documentary will give you the fuller and more careful accounting of exactly how many fell into each of those 2 categories in the chapter that follows this one, because those numbers deserve a chapter entirely their own, given how much genuine disagreement exists across the sources about exactly what they were. For now, it is enough to say that by early to mid-afternoon, the fighting that had begun with 3 destroyed self-propelled guns and a confident radio silence being broken to report trouble had ended with something close to the complete destruction of 2 entire Ranger battalions as functioning combat units. There is one more part of this day's story that belongs here, a parallel effort that unfolded separately from everything this documentary has just described, and that deserves to be told honestly, on its own terms, rather than folded quietly into the larger disaster. The 4th Ranger Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Roy Murray, had been assigned, as this documentary described in an earlier chapter, its own separate route, advancing along the road running from Conca through Isola Bella towards Cisterna, intended to serve as the operations reserve and to link up with the 1st and 3rd Battalions once Cisterna itself had fallen. Murray's battalion advanced as planned, but it ran into heavy German fire and extensive minefields well short of its objective, and despite being reinforced during the day with additional armor support in an effort to break through, it was unable to fight its way past Isola Bella and reach the trapped battalions in time to change what was happening to them. This documentary wants to be clear that this was not a failure of nerve or effort on the part of the 4th Battalion's own men. It was stopped by a genuinely strong German defense along its own separate route, a defense that, in its own smaller way, reflects the same underlying intelligence failure this documentary has already described. Nobody on the Allied side, planning this operation, appears to have understood just how heavily this entire sector had been reinforced in the days immediately before the attack. The 4th Battalion's own losses in this failed relief effort were real and painful in their own right, consistently given across sources as 30 men killed and 58 wounded. Set against what happened to the 1st and 3rd Battalions that same day, that toll is a fraction of the larger catastrophe. But this documentary does not want you to lose sight of it entirely, because 30 families received the same kind of telegram that the families of men lost in the encircled battalions eventually received, for a battalion that had done everything asked of it, and simply could not fight its way through a defense that had grown, in the space of a few days before the attack, into something far stronger than anyone had expected to find there. This documentary has reached the chapter it has been building toward since its very first sentence, the chapter that carries the numbers sitting right there in this film's own title. It wants to slow down here, more than almost anywhere else in this entire 2-hour account, and walk through those numbers with real care, because getting them right and being honest about where the sources genuinely disagree matters more here than almost anywhere else in this story. Begin with the number that is not seriously disputed. The total force committed to this operation, the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions combined, along with the attached platoon of the 3rd Reconnaissance Troop, this documentary mentioned earlier, came to roughly 767 men. This figure is well supported across independent sources, and this documentary states it to you with real confidence. 767 Americans crossed the Mussolini Canal and moved into the Pantano Ditch in the dark hours before dawn on the 30th of January, 1944. The number who escaped that trap and made it back to American lines is a genuinely different matter, and this documentary is not going to pretend otherwise simply to give you a tidier story. 6 is the figure repeated most often in the most sources, and it is the figure carried in this film's own title, so this documentary uses it here as its headline number. But the United States Army's own historians of its Special Operations Forces, the office responsible for the Army's institutional history of units exactly like this one, writing with access to a wide base of records, state that 8 men returned, not 6. And at least one account frames the number slightly differently again, describing it as 6 Rangers plus 1 additional trooper from the reconnaissance troop making it back separately, a formulation that could reasonably be read as 7 or as 8, depending on exactly how one chooses to count and categorize that additional man. This documentary is not going to force these versions into false agreement. It will tell you plainly and ask you to sit with the uncertainty rather than resolve it artificially. As few as 6, and by some careful counts, as many as 8, of the 767 men who went into that ditch made it back to their own lines by the following afternoon. Whichever specific number is closest to the truth, the shape of what it tells you does not change. Out of 767 men, a number that could be counted, quite literally, on the fingers of 2 hands made it home. What happened to the roughly 760 who did not return is where this documentary needs to be most careful of all, because here the sources do not merely differ by a digit or two. They differ by an order of magnitude, and this documentary is going to present both traditions to you, fully and honestly, exactly as the research behind this film insists it must, rather than quietly choosing the version that happens to sound more dramatic or more convenient for a 2-hour film. The first tradition comes from the United States Army's own official wartime accounting of this battle, a version of events echoed in later writing by the Army's own special operations historians. This official wartime tally records 12 men killed, 36 wounded, and 743 captured. This documentary wants to flag something honestly about these particular numbers before moving any further, because it would be dishonest to simply repeat them without comment. Add 12, 36, and 743 together, and the total comes to 791, a figure slightly larger than the 767 men who actually went into the ditch that night. That is an inconsistency in the official figures themselves, and this documentary is not going to smooth it over or quietly adjust the numbers to make them add up more neatly than the historical record actually presents them. The most likely explanation, though this documentary presents it as a reasonable inference rather than a confirmed fact, is that many of the men counted among the wounded were also counted separately among the captured, rather than representing an entirely distinct additional group of casualties layered on top of the total force committed. Wounded men taken prisoner would naturally appear in both categories in a hastily assembled wartime tally, and a discrepancy of this size is consistent with that kind of overlapping counting rather than with some larger, unexplained addition to the force. But this documentary wants to be honest that this is an inference, not a certainty, and it would rather flag the inconsistency plainly than pretend the official numbers are cleaner than they actually are. The second tradition comes from later historical scholarship, most prominently from the military historian Stephen Zaloga in his book Anzio 1944, The Beleaguered Beachhead, published by Osprey in 2005. Zaloga's figures, drawn from research conducted decades after the war, working from what could be established about what actually happened to the men taken prisoner rather than relying solely on the wartime tally compiled in the fog and confusion of the battle's immediate aftermath, are dramatically different. 311 killed and 450 captured. Under this second accounting, the number of dead is not 12. It is more than 300, a figure roughly 25 times larger than the official wartime count. This documentary is going to say this plainly, because it is the single most important sentence in this entire chapter. It will not pretend to resolve which of these two accounts is correct. The wartime reports compiled by the unit itself in the days immediately after the battle recorded 12 men killed and the overwhelming majority of the rest as captured, prisoners of war rather than casualties in the more permanent sense. Later historians, working decades afterward and attempting to trace what actually became of the men who were taken prisoner that day, have put the number who ultimately died far higher, into the hundreds, suggesting that a great many of the men recorded as captured in 1944 did not, in fact, survive their captivity, or did not survive whatever happened to them in the chaotic hours and days immediately following their capture, before they could be formally processed and accounted for as prisoners of war at all. These two accounts differ sharply, by a margin of hundreds of men, and this documentary does not have a way to tell you definitively which one is closer to the truth. It has tried, throughout this entire film, to be honest with you about where the historical record is settled and where it is not. Nowhere in this entire story is that honesty more important than it is right here, with the number of men who died. This documentary also wants to be honest about a related gap in what it has been able to find. It went looking for reliable information about which German prisoner of war camps the captured Rangers were eventually sent to, and about the specific conditions and treatment they experienced in captivity, information that would help explain how a wartime count of a dozen dead could possibly be reconciled, or fail to be reconciled, with a later count running into the hundreds. It could not find that information documented with enough confidence to bring to you here. The surviving record on this specific question, the fate of the men who were marched away from that battlefield as prisoners, is thin, and this documentary would rather tell you plainly that it is thin than invent camp names or conditions it cannot actually support with a source. Somewhere between 12 deaths and 311 deaths lies whatever actually happened to those men, and this documentary, despite real effort, cannot close that gap for you tonight. There is one more set of figures this documentary wants to restate clearly and separately here, because it would be easy, moving quickly through a chapter full of large and disputed numbers, to blur it together with everything else. The 4th Ranger Battalion's own losses in its failed effort to relieve the trapped 1st and 3rd Battalions, which this documentary described in the previous chapter, were 30 men killed and 58 wounded. That figure is well attested and not seriously disputed across the sources this documentary has drawn on, and it belongs to a different battalion, fighting along a different road, and should not be confused or combined with the far larger and far more disputed numbers attached to the 2 encircled battalions this chapter has just walked you through. 767 men went into the Pantano ditch. As few as 6, or as many as 8, came back, and somewhere between 12 and 311 of the rest did not survive what happened to them after that. This documentary has told you everything it honestly knows about that gap, and everything it honestly does not know as well, and it will carry that same honesty forward into the chapters that remain. The destruction of the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions on the 30th of January effectively ended Derby's original Ranger force as a functioning combat formation. This documentary wants to be precise about what that sentence actually means, because it is easy, from a distance of 8 decades, to state it almost casually as a simple fact of military history, without pausing on what it actually represented at the time. A unit that had been built with enormous care, trained to a standard few other formations in the entire United States Army could match, and that had fought with real distinction across more than a year of hard campaigning, ceased, in the space of a single winter morning, to exist as the force it had been the day before. The formal administrative end came a few weeks later. The 6,615th Ranger Force, provisional, the organization this documentary described in an earlier chapter, bringing together all 3 battalions under Derby's overall command, was formally disbanded, a step generally dated to the 19th of February, 1944. What became of the men who remained is recorded somewhat differently across the sources this documentary has drawn on, but the broad shape of it can be given with reasonable confidence. Roughly 150 men eventually returned to the United States. Roughly 400 more were transferred into the 1st Special Service Force, the joint American and Canadian commando unit that had built its own formidable reputation fighting in mountainous terrain elsewhere in Italy. And these transferred Rangers went on, under that unit's colors, to take part in the liberation of Rome later that same year, and afterward in the invasion of southern France. It is worth noting, gently, that these men carried what they had survived at Cisterna forward with them into further hard fighting, rather than being given any real opportunity to rest or process what had happened before returning to combat, a reality that says something quiet but important about how little consideration was given, in that era of the war, to what a modern military would now recognize as the psychological toll of an experience like the one these men had just lived through. The 4th Ranger Battalion, which this documentary told you in an earlier chapter had not been destroyed at Cisterna, though it had paid its own real price in the failed relief effort along the Conca Isola Bella road, continued on a while longer as an intact fighting unit. It helped repel a German counterattack on the 4th of February, in the days immediately following the disaster that had consumed its two sister battalions, before it, too, was eventually reassigned away from the Ranger Force framework Darby had built. By the spring of 1944, the specific institutional structure that had carried the name Darby's Rangers through Sicily, Salerno, the Winter Line, and finally Cisterna, no longer existed in the form it had taken for the better part of 2 years. This documentary wants to spend real time now on the question of why this happened, because it is a question this production takes seriously, and because the honest answer is genuinely multi-factor, rather than a matter of any single villain or any single decisive mistake. Virtually every source this documentary has consulted agrees that the core proximate cause of the disaster was faulty Allied intelligence about how lightly Cisterna was actually held. The plan itself, as this documentary described several chapters ago, was a reasonable one, built on a real and substantial record of similar operations succeeding before, given accurate information about what was actually waiting at the objective. It was not given that accurate information, and that failure sits close to the center of everything that followed. The German buildup that transformed a thin outpost screen into a heavily reinforced alert defensive position appears, as this documentary explained in an earlier chapter, to have been largely coincidental to the Ranger operation itself, driven by Field Marshal Kesselring's own preparations for a counteroffensive against the Anzio beachhead that had nothing specifically to do with foreknowledge of Darby's plan. This documentary is not going to restate the full nuance of that discussion here, since it gave it real space earlier in this film, but it is worth repeating the basic shape of it. The Rangers appear to have stumbled into an already dangerous situation rather than walked deliberately into a trap constructed specifically to catch them, though, as this documentary noted earlier, the official Army history leaves room for the possibility that German forces detected their approach with enough warning to prepare more deliberately for it. There is a third factor, though, one that several historians studying this battle, including the United States Army's own historians of its Special Operations Forces, writing decades after the fact, consider at least as important as either of the first two, and this documentary wants to give it real weight here because it connects directly back to the pattern this film flagged for you several chapters ago, before the battle itself had even begun. Darby's Rangers were built, trained, and equipped as an elite, lightly armed infiltration and raiding force, superbly suited to fast, decisive strikes against limited objectives, executed by stealth and speed, and then followed by a quick withdrawal before the enemy could organize a heavier response. That is what Acna Carey had trained them for, and it is what they had proven, repeatedly, they could do exceptionally well in their earliest operations. But this documentary walked you, in an earlier chapter, through how that mission had shifted over the year before Cisterna. Static defensive fighting at Salerno, holding the Chiunzi Pass under sustained counterattack for more than 2 weeks, extended attritional mountain fighting through the Winter Line that following autumn and winter, used as conventional infantry rather than as the specialized raiding force they had been built to be. By the time these battalions were committed to Cisterna, they were still called Rangers, still trained to the same exceptional individual standard, but they had increasingly been asked, mission after mission, to do the job of conventional line infantry, without the heavy weapons, the armor support, or the numerical depth that ordinary infantry divisions could draw on when a fight went against them. At Cisterna, committed once again to an offensive mission well beyond the kind of raid they had been built for, and this time meeting a conventional enemy force reinforced far beyond what anyone expected. That gap between what these men were equipped and organized to do, and what they were actually being asked to do, finally proved fatal. This documentary wants to be clear that this framing, the misemployment of elite light infantry as conventional line troops, is not this production's own interpretation invented for dramatic effect. It is treated by the Army's own special operations historians as one of the genuinely formative lessons drawn from this entire battle, a lesson that shaped how the American military thought about the proper use of special operations forces for decades afterward, long past the end of the Second World War itself. There is one further, more personal detail this documentary wants to include here, though it wants to be honest with you about how it is sourced before repeating it. It is widely reported, in popular and secondary accounts of this battle, rather than in any single independently verified primary document this documentary has been able to locate, that Colonel Darby, upon receiving Sergeant Major E. Halt's final transmission, and coming to understand fully that his battalions were being destroyed in front of him with nothing he could do to stop it, put his head in his hands and wept. This documentary is not going to present that image to you as an ironclad, formally documented fact, because it cannot verify it to that standard. But it is going to include it here, honestly labeled as widely reported, rather than certain, because whether or not that precise moment happened exactly as it has been retold, it captures something true about the position Darby found himself in that afternoon. A commander who had built this force with his own hands, who had trained alongside these men, rather than simply ordering them into danger from a distance, listening over a failing radio link as it was destroyed, utterly unable to reach it or save it, and carrying that afternoon with him, in one way or another, for the remaining 15 months of his own life. This documentary is nearly finished walking you through what actually happened south of Cisterna on the 30th of January 1944. Before it brings this story to its close, it wants to spend some time with a different kind of question. What this battle has come to mean, in the 80 years since, to the institution that grew, in a direct and unbroken line, out of the force that Darby built, and that was destroyed on that flat winter field. The modern 75th Ranger Regiment, formally established in 1986, inherited the lineage and the honors of every prior American unit to carry the Ranger name, including Darby's original 1st Battalion, the 3rd Battalion that Miller led into that ditch, and the 4th Battalion that Murray led along its own separate, ultimately futile relief route. That inheritance means Cisterna is not a forgotten footnote sitting somewhere outside the official institutional memory of today's Army Rangers. It is formally part of the regiment's own history, referenced deliberately in Ranger training and heritage materials, and this documentary wants to be precise about the particular way it is referenced, because it is not held up primarily as a story of triumph, the way some of the Ranger Force's earlier operations in Sicily and at El Guitar tend to be. It is held up, instead, as a foundational case study in the correct and incorrect employment of special operations forces, a battle studied specifically because of what it teaches about what happens when an elite, lightly equipped raiding force is committed to a mission beyond its actual capabilities against an enemy whose true strength was not properly understood beforehand. That is a very particular kind of institutional memory to carry forward across 8 decades, closer to a cautionary lesson passed down deliberately from one generation of soldiers to the next than to a celebrated victory retold with pride. Both kinds of memory matter to an institution like the modern Ranger Regiment, and this documentary thinks it says something meaningful, that Cisterna has been preserved as the second kind rather than allowed to simply fade away out of a natural reluctance to dwell on a defeat. There is a more physical, more ceremonial layer of memory attached to this story as well, and this documentary wants to walk through it, because it connects the abstract institutional lesson back to actual places and actual people who have chosen to keep this story alive in tangible ways. The town of Cisterna itself and Fort Smith, Arkansas, the town where William Darby was born, are sister cities, a formal civic relationship built explicitly around the connection between the man and the place he died trying to help liberate, only a few months and a few dozen miles removed from where his Rangers had suffered their worst single day. A local high school in Cisterna carries Darby's name, and each year, United States Army personnel stationed in Italy take part in what is known as the Derby Challenge, a demanding endurance march of roughly 40 miles conducted near Vicenza in northern Italy, held explicitly in his honor, a modern echo, in its own small way, of the kind of grueling physical test Derby himself endured alongside his men at Achnacary more than 80 years ago now. There is also, for anyone who wants to spend more time with this story than any single film could ever offer, a dedicated book worth mentioning here, The Road to Cisterna, Derby's Rangers and Their Most Consequential Battle in World War II, written by David Lyle Williams and published by LSU Press. This documentary understands that book to be built on more than 2 decades of the author's own interviews with surviving Derby Rangers, conversations conducted, in many cases, with men who had been present for the events this documentary has just walked you through, capturing their first-hand memories before those memories were lost entirely to time, the way the memories of nearly every other event of this war are steadily, inevitably being lost as the generation that lived through it passes on. For anyone who finishes this 2-hour account and wants to go further, that book exists precisely to take you there. It is worth noting, too, how differently this story tends to be received depending on who is doing the listening. Veterans of the modern Ranger Regiment and students of Special Operations history, encountering this battle through official lineage documents and professional military education, tend to come away from it with a sober, analytical appreciation for the intelligence and doctrinal lessons it offers. The kind of appreciation this documentary tried to capture in an earlier chapter when it discussed the misemployment of elite light infantry as conventional line troops. Family members researching a grandfather or great-uncle who served in the 1st or 3rd Ranger Battalion, by contrast, tend to come to this same story from an entirely different direction, searching genealogical records and unit rosters not for doctrinal lessons, but for a single name, hoping to learn simply what happened to one particular young man on one particular morning 80 years ago. This documentary has tried, across the last 2 hours, to serve both of those audiences honestly, the analytical and the personal, without letting either one crowd out the other, because both are genuine and legitimate ways of caring about what happened here. This documentary wants to close this chapter by drawing a comparison. The research behind this film specifically highlighted as worth including, because it says something true about where this particular battle sits in the broader landscape of American public memory of the Second World War. Compared to Pointe du Hoc, where the 2nd Ranger Battalion, an entirely separate unit, this documentary was careful to distinguish from Derby's force several chapters ago, scaled those cliffs under fire on the morning of D-Day, or compared to the Cabanatuan raid in the Pacific, both stories that occupy a genuinely prominent place in general American popular memory, appearing in films and popular histories and museum exhibits reaching a broad public audience. Cisterna is, by comparison, relatively obscure outside of Ranger and Special Operations circles specifically. Ask most people who have a general familiarity with the Second World War about Anzio, and they are far more likely to know the name of the beachhead itself, or the controversy surrounding General Lucas's caution in its opening days, than they are to know anything at all about what happened to a pair of Ranger battalions in a drainage ditch a few miles inland, 9 days after that landing. Within the more specialized world of Ranger history and Special Operations study, though Cisterna is very well known indeed, studied closely and taught deliberately, precisely because it functions there not as a story of triumph, but as a formative institutional trauma, a hard and permanent lesson about the limits of what even the finest infantry in the world can accomplish when it is sent against an enemy whose actual strength nobody on your own side has correctly understood. That is where this battle sits today, 80 years on, largely unknown to the broader public and treated with real and lasting seriousness by the institution that grew directly out of the men who fought and, in most cases, did not survive it. Let us go back, one more time, to that drainage ditch, before this documentary finally lets you rest. Picture it as it was in the last hour before dawn, on the 30th of January, 1944, before any of what you have spent the last 2 hours listening to had actually happened. A narrow, sunken channel cut through flat, reclaimed farmland, water standing cold and half frozen at the bottom of it, running roughly parallel to a road that led, eventually, to a small town most of the men moving through that channel had never seen and never would. 767 Americans, moving in a long, patient, single file, trusting the plan they had been given, trusting the training that had carried them through Sicily and Salerno and a long winter of mountain fighting before this night, trusting, above all, each other, the way soldiers in a column like that one have always had to trust each other. One man's silence and discipline protecting the man walking behind him. None of them, as far as this documentary can tell you with any confidence, understood what waited on the other side of that open ground near Cisterna. That is worth remembering at the very end of this story, because it is easy, once you already know how a story ends, to imagine that the people actually living through it somehow sensed it coming, felt some shadow of the disaster ahead of them in the dark. They did not. They found out gradually, over the course of a single winter morning, in the open, the way people always do, without the benefit of the calm, retrospective voice this documentary has been able to offer you across the last 2 hours. This documentary has tried, across those 2 hours, to hold several things in its hands at once, carefully, without letting any one of them crowd out the others. It has tried to hold the plain, considerable skill and discipline these men brought to that infiltration, the same discipline that had carried Darby's Rangers through amphibious assaults and mountain raids, and a fighting withdrawal through the Chiunzi Pass held for more than 2 weeks against sustained counterattack. It has tried to hold the honest, uncomfortable truth about how that skill and discipline, superb as it was not enough on this particular morning against an enemy whose true strength nobody on the American side had correctly understood before the column ever crossed the Mussolini Canal. And it has tried, above almost everything else in this film, to hold the genuine, significant disagreements that still exist among careful historians about exactly what this battle cost, rather than quietly picking whichever number made for the cleanest 2-hour film and moving on as though no real dispute existed. 6 men, or as many as 8, 12 dead, by one wartime accounting, or upward of 300, by later and more painstaking historical research. This documentary told you, back in its very first minutes, that the gap between 767 and a mere handful of survivors was the whole shape of this story. It has tried, in the 2 hours since, to walk you through that gap as honestly and as carefully as the available record allows, without ever pretending the record was more settled than it actually is. It is worth saying, too, something about why a battle like this one, largely unknown outside of Ranger and Special Operations circles, deserves the same unhurried, careful telling. This channel has given to the more widely remembered battles of this same terrible century. Cisterna was not, by any measure, a turning point in the wider war. It did not change the ultimate outcome of the fighting at Anzio, or the fighting in Italy more broadly, or the fighting in Europe as a whole, which continued for more than another year after that January morning, through the eventual capture of Rome and the long, grinding advance up the remainder of the Italian peninsula and beyond. In the grand strategic sweep of the Second World War, the destruction of 2 Ranger battalions south of a small Italian town is, in the most narrow and unfeeling sense, a small event. But this documentary does not believe that strategic scale is the only measure, or even the most important measure, of which stories deserve to be told with real care. 767 men, most of them still young, many of them already veterans of hard fighting in Sicily and at Salerno, and through a brutal winter in the mountains, walked into that ditch believing in a plan their own colonel had called down our alley. What happened to them afterward was not a small event to the wives and mothers and fathers who eventually received word of what had become of their sons and husbands, whether that word came quickly, in the case of the confirmed dead, or slowly and agonizingly, over months and sometimes years, in the case of men whose fate as prisoners took far longer to establish with any certainty. Scale on a map is not the only scale that matters. This documentary has tried, tonight, to measure this story by the other scale instead, the one that counts individual human beings rather than strategic consequences. What this documentary hopes you carry away from the last 2 hours is not, in the end, a precise casualty count, or the exact wording of Colonel Darby's own description of his plan, or even the specific breakdown between the wartime tally and the later historical estimate of how many of these men actually died. Numbers like that matter, and this documentary has tried, throughout this film, to get them right, or, where they cannot be gotten right with any real confidence, to tell you honestly that they cannot be gotten right rather than pretending otherwise. But numbers, in the end, are not what this story is actually about. What it is about is a colonel who trained alongside the men he commanded and who was not there, on the one morning it would have mattered most for him to be, through no fault or failure of his own, and who carried what happened to his rangers with him for the rest of his own short life. It is about 2 majors, Jack Dobson and Alva Miller, who led their battalions into that ditch trusting a plan built on the best information available to them, one of whom would not survive the day, and the other of whom would spend its final hours wounded, holding together a command that had never been meant to fall to him alone. It is about a captain nicknamed for his fearlessness, captured and later returning to his own lines by a path this documentary could not fully trace for you. And it is about a sergeant major who used what might have been among the last words he ever spoke to, apologize, on behalf of exhausted, out-of-ammunition men who had nothing left to be sorry for at all. This documentary does not know, and has told you honestly throughout this film where it does not know, the fuller fate of most of those 760 men who did not walk back to American lines that afternoon. It does not know which camps held the prisoners among them, or what those months in captivity actually looked like, or how many of the men counted as captured in the confused tally taken in the days after the battle ultimately survived to see the war's end the following year. That is a genuine gap in the historical record, not a gap in this documentary's effort to find the answer, and this film would rather leave that gap open and acknowledged than fill it with invented certainty. Somewhere in that gap are hundreds of individual human stories this documentary simply could not tell you tonight, because no one, as far as this production has been able to determine, wrote them down clearly enough, early enough, for them to survive into the historical record at all. That is worth sitting with, quietly, for a moment, before this film lets the story go. It is worth imagining, too, what the weeks and months that followed must have carried for the small handful of men, 6 or 8, whichever number is closer to the truth, who did make it back to American lines that afternoon, or in the days immediately after. What does it mean to be one of 6, or one of 8, out of 767, and to go on living, decade after decade, carrying that particular arithmetic with you for the rest of your life? This documentary cannot answer that question from the outside, and it will not pretend to. But it believes that arithmetic, more than any strategic map or any account of German armored strength, is the true center of gravity of this entire story. The fact this documentary most wants you to carry with you as it draws to its close. And it is worth remembering, finally, the town itself, Cisterna, sitting quietly today, at peace, connected across the ocean to a small city in Arkansas, by a friendship built directly out of the events this documentary has just told you. A friendship that exists precisely because a town in Italy and a town in America both decided, independently and deliberately, that this story was worth remembering formally, in stone and in ceremony, rather than letting it fade the way so many smaller battles of that enormous war eventually did. Those 767 men never got to see Cisterna the way their plan intended them to see it, entering it at dawn, having taken it by surprise, moving on afterward to whatever came next, in a war that still had more than a year left to run. This documentary has tried, instead, to bring you to that ditch alongside them, in the only way still available across 8 decades of distance, through careful, patient, honest narration, so that their walk through that cold, dark channel would not simply disappear into a single line in a larger history of a larger battle at a larger beachhead. That is the story of Cisterna, told as carefully and as honestly as this documentary knows how to tell it. 767 men, a ditch, a canal, a town they mostly never reached, and a night that, 80 years later, is still worth remembering exactly as it actually happened, disputed numbers and all, without needing to be made any larger or any tidier than it already was. Thank you for spending these 2 hours here tonight. If you are still listening, wherever you are, however late it has gotten while this story played out quietly around you, this documentary hopes the sound of this voice has done for you what it always tries to do at the end of a long night like this one. Not to leave you with anything urgent to think about, not one more number to hold on to, or one more date to remember, but simply to let the day, and everything that came with it, finally go quiet around you. Let your shoulders drop, if they have not already. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest, here, in the dark, the same dark that once carried 767 men toward a town they were never quite able to reach. Good night. Sleep well, and thank you truly for spending this quiet history with us.